Hi everyone. I wanted to share with you a little bit about how I got into the work of thanatology and gradually becoming a death doula as well as a grief coach. I'm sitting here in an amazing forest, Makwao, where the Maui fires occurred, one of the places where the Maui fires occurred. And this was about 8 months ago. It's been almost 9 months, like a birth. And actually, yeah, the beginning of next month, it will have been a birth. And as you can see, there's a charred stump here behind me, and there's trees that have fallen all around here. There's trees that didn't fall that are just charred and still making their way up towards the sun. And there's also some new growth. So from all of this comes rebirth, always. And it was also kind of hard to come back into this forest. It's a place I've spent a lot of time, and it had been closed as they kind of repaired the trail and things. So here I am. I experienced a little bit of grief of my own coming back in here. But I wanted to share my story of how I got into this work. And I got a straight shot to it with my mom's cancer. And she was diagnosed when I was 19. I had been out of the home for a year, gone away out of state to university. And she was diagnosed, came back, cared for her for 4 months till she died of ovarian cancer. I was 19, she was 54. And we were fortunate enough to have a therapist, counselor person look me straight in the eye and say, I think it's time for hospice. And at that time, when we'd been pushing so hard to get her better and fighting the cancer, that was one of the hardest things to hear. And now, hindsight, I feel like she was one of the biggest angels in my life by telling me, it's time. It's time to call hospice. When hospice got there, they were the ones who knew how to care for my mom as to how she was at that time, how she was doing. They had all kinds of tricks and tips and also just could talk to me as a teenager. I really didn't meet too many people during that time, which really struck me. I didn't know too many people who could actually talk to me and be with me and talk about death and the dying process. Few people can talk about it, but even fewer people know how to handle it, what might occur, practicalities of it, as well as emotional, spiritual aspects of it. And so I was really struck as a teenager who, was just barely gone out of home and figuring out what the heck she was going to become in her life. I was really struck by the compassion, the competence, the presence that my hospice nurse brought and other hospice people brought, as well as my uncle. Shout out to my tio, Roberto, who was a hospice volunteer, not for the hospice my mom was on, but he came and was there, and just brought up the whole topic with my mom. Anyway, I could go into details about the death, but I'm talking about how I got into the work. It was pretty profound for me, a really huge shift in my life. Lots of complicated grief happening with things happening between my mom and dad, their relationship as she neared death, things happening with the preparations that my dad was making to take off from that house that I'd grown up in and where she died. He was ready to head on out and moved on healthily, but that was hard for a teenager to see everything, it was all out the door. We did a garage sale, and so watching people rummage through her stuff, it just all really, and I'm also a highly sensitive person, so just really was like, oh, like, whoa. I think I had to go kind of numb. I just kept working. I kept working and went back to school after a semester off, actually still took classes remotely, that semester off. Just kept going. That was my way of dealing with it. And it wasn't until years later, although what I did soon after I got back to school, I decided I wanted to know about this death thing. What was it? How come nobody can talk about it? What the hell just happened to me and my family and my mom? And so I went to the local hospice and I wanted to volunteer is what I showed up for. And the woman said, well, how long ago did your mom die? Maybe you should consider going to the grief group yourself. So that's what I did. And that was my first taste of being in the presence of others, sharing your story while in grief. It took me a while, though, to crack that shell of kind of numbness. So I can't even remember crying with people. I would cry by myself once in a while, but the idea of showing any kind of emotions around others just didn't feel quite, I don't know, I just wasn't there. And then I think next stop was, so then I did get into volunteering in my early 20s for hospice, and I did their training, and they had this awesome thing. They didn't want anybody to die alone. So if someone was in a nursing home, say, or they didn't have family around, they wanted their volunteers to be there like through the night. If somebody couldn't be there with them, they felt like no one should die alone. And so I ended up being there. They would call me into several deaths where the person wasn't letting go, seemed to kind of be hanging on. And then I would go, and then they would go. So that was kind of special. It was like I kind of just sensed pretty early on and was shown that I had a knack for it. I just was more comfortable around it than maybe some other people might be. And I could very easily sense what a person, was going through and put myself in their shoes and, come up with ways to make them more comfortable and peaceful. So that was my start, was the volunteering. And then it progressed into paid positions. My 88-year-old neighbor, he lost his wife. His wife died, and then a year later, his health was kind of going down, which is not uncommon for couples who have been together for a while. And he was in need of a caregiver, a companion. His family helped set it up, and they hired me. And he and I had a conversation about the fact that I'd cared for my mom while she died, and I think that was very influential. And then I kind of let him know, he turned into a great friend. And I let him know, I'm here for you if this is the route you're going. He had liver cancer, and that was the route he was going. And so that death of me caring for him, lasted about 9-10 months. And then he died a brave, peaceful, incredibly coherent death. And he came to us one day and said, I have heard that people die if they stop eating. They'll die within 10 days, I think is what he had read. And he was ready, and he was weak. The cancer had taken over most of his body. So he was already dying, but he was kind of like, I think I'm ready. Let's do this. So that now has a term in the end-of-life care realms. They abbreviate it VSED, which I think is kind of funny, but it's voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. And that, back 20 some odd years, is what my dear friend Ed Smith did. And that is how he ended up actually going. And I was with him. And that is an honor when people allow you to be with them. I was with my mother as well at the moment of their last breath. That is an honor, true honor. It's a pretty spectacular window into another world. And then I had brought on a friend of mine as a caregiver. We needed more help with Ed towards the end. And months later, heard about a friend. So it was a friend of a friend's grandmother who needed care. And it was specifically her son, the friend's father, who needed to hire someone. He needed help. And his mother had congestive heart failure, and she was dementia. She had dementia as well. So her mind was going a little bit. And they hired me. And again, it was about 9 to 10 months that I was with them. That when I had to kind of work with them on the fact that it's time for hospice. I think it's time. They weren't sure. They called the doctor. The doctor said, oh, no, 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 it's not time for that. Come on in, we'll do this test. They brought her in, wheeled her in, so weak, hunched over in a wheelchair, and determined the same thing I had said. Yes, it was time for hospice. When she got on hospice, it's just loads of help with supplies and things that you need at that time. And then I wasn't there present at that final moment with her, but on up to the end, another really beautiful death. And it's hard to know how much detail to say because these were all very influential experiences in my life as a young woman, in my 20s. And they just kind of kept showing up, and I just kept handling them pretty well. And then after that, what came about was me kind of taking more of a proactive stance. Like, well, how would I want to work in this realm? I thought, do I want to work in a funeral home, like after death care, or do I want to work in hospice? Would I want to go down the clinical route? And none of those felt great. But then I heard about this position for a hospice liaison, where the hospice worker is interfacing with the community and with doctors, and kind of a bridge between the medical world and palliative and hospice care. And I thought, okay, that's for me. And then I was hired. I made out a resume for it. I waited a year. I'd been on Maui for about a year just to kind of get a feel for the culture here. And I made out a resume and brought it to Hospice Maui. And they were kind of like, oh, because they were looking for someone like that. Another hospice was showing up on the island. They'd been the only hospice for a long time. And another one was coming, and they thought, well, we kind of need to just be sure our relationships with everyone in the community are good. And so I was hired. And so I did that for years. And I also ended up moving to another island, doing it at another hospice, what is now called Navian Hospice. At that time, it was Hospice Hawaii. And that was a really great experience for me. I got to see how varied people's knowledge of what hospice is by doing health fairs and going into doctors' offices and talking to doctors and medical personnel and nurses. A lot of people have a lot of strange ideas of what hospice is. And at that time, I also got to see how hospice was shifting in terms of, there's a lot of hospices now that are for-profit versus what they were at one time, strictly volunteer-based and nonprofit. So just different motives coming in. And again, that could be a whole other video. But I got to a point where I just wasn't quite being fulfilled by the work. And I loved being able to talk with people when I was giving presentations and things. But it wasn't quite my angle on death and dying and how it could be and how it went with my mom, with Ed, and with Jean. I'd seen what it could be. I'd also seen what it could be by helping friends put down their dogs, and how beautiful, and how it could be a celebration of that animal or person's life at the end, when there's some sense of surrender to what's happening. You're never completely in acceptance of losing someone we love, but when there's some level of surrender, it's pretty amazing. And so I just kind of wanted to bring that more to the world. So I got this idea to go out on my own. And that's when I started looking, well, I'm not a nurse, I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm not a chaplain, I'm not a social worker, what am I? And I started looking and researching, and I found the Association for Death Education and Counseling. And they offer a certification in thanatology. thanatology, death, dying, and bereavement. Started looking at the requirements, and I'm like, I've got all of those requirements. You had to prove you'd been employed in an end-of-life care, institution, facility, organization for some odd years. You had to have letters of recommendation from people in the field, and you had to pass a written exam. No problem. Got the big, thick books and started studying, and I got my certification. So that was a big yay for me, because it was like all that time and years in the field of learning, and also just discovering that I kind of had a knack for it and could be present during that time with people in a way that not everybody can. It was really nice to see that there was some way for me to get some sort of piece of paper saying, okay, this is what I do. And then this whole term death doula started becoming a thing. And here on Maui, Doorway into Light started offering the death doula training. And I looked at what they were talking about, and I'm like, oh, okay, so what I was doing, we called myself, I was hired as a caregiver, but I started realizing what I was doing was a death doula. Then I was hired by a woman here on the island to care for her mother, and that, again, just incredibly beautiful, challenging, so challenging at moments, but in the culmination, just a beautiful, peaceful passing with her mom. And the woman, her daughter, who hired me, became a good friend and still is. And she encouraged me. She looked at me one day and said, I don't think you're my caregiver anymore. You're my death coach. So she's the one who kind of helped me shift it as well. And at that time, I think I was studying to get my certification in thanatology. So things were kind of shifting in my brain, like, okay, I'm taking more of a leadership role here. I'm not just a caregiver. Not that caregiver is ever just a just. Caregiving is huge. But I could see that I was kind of teaching others to do it, not necessarily doing the care at the bedside. I was actually coaching others to do it, family members and other caregivers to do it. To a degree, I was starting to educate people on how to handle the dying process and how to be a compassionate presence for people who are dying. And then I took Doorway into Light's death doula training and just met people like me. There was people from all over just like me. So it was really great to network at that. And I left there like totally fired up to start teaching. So I started a workshop, and I had 2 people show up. It was a workshop in Honolulu, and the ripple effect from just those 2 people coming was profound. And I forget what I called it at that time. Holistic dying holistically, holistic living and dying, something like that. And just the serendipity. A month after that training, the guy who was a yoga instructor himself, who went to the training, his mother showed up in the hospital and died, and he felt like he had so much more preparation and knew how to talk to the family on the phone before he got there to ask how she was and what was going on. He had the communication, he had the words to do that. And then the gal who was in the class, her mother had heart problems as well as her father, and so she connected me with her mother, who became a client as her father died, and is still doing well as far as I know in her health. And just really was wonderfully grateful for our work together. And then it kind of just rippled from there, and I have been experimenting with different ways of teaching, different classes. During COVID, I went completely online, and that's mostly been what I do, but I'm starting to have more local one-on-one clients with grief, as well as end-of-life care planning, as well as people who are dying. So, it's just, I'm definitely led within this work. And sometimes when people ask me what I do, they're like, oh, that's hard. It just hasn't ever felt like that to me. I believe it's what brings about a lot of joy and a lot of moments of living fully and enjoying, my abilities and my aliveness more than I ever would had I not been around people who are dying, had I not been exposed to how quickly a life goes, had I not been exposed to so many people who feel regrets for how they handled a situation, yet they did the best they could. It just really shifts how you go about your everyday living, having been exposed to all these different phases of life and people. And it's also really special if you have ever been at a death that's there's somewhat some surrender and acceptance around it, and it's in a home. It can be really quite amazing. I got the chance to be present at my nephew's birth, and when I watched the midwife, what she was doing, I was like, she does exactly what I do at a death. And to me, the vibration was very similar, not that different. And there's just a such a power of it's that life force at those times of life, birth and death. And I call my business Laura Minor End of Life Care, but I really don't believe there's an end of life. My beliefs, my personal beliefs, are that there's death is kind of a misnomer. I mean, we shift forms and we're off. I have felt it. We're like a spirit leave a body, but that spirit's still alive and well and on to the next. And there's no one really dies. the at least the deaths I've been present at. And at the same time, we have to honor in such a much more profound way what a loss it can be to have someone so close to us and such a big part of our world ripped out. And I think our culture not learning about the dying process and not being present at death, and how we sweep it away or put it aside in a nursing home, and we're not with our loved ones when they go, or we think professionals should be doing it, because it is scary, and if we've never done it, we don't know how, and if we're not exposed to it, we don't know how. So it's like, what's first, the chicken or the egg? It's like this whole catch-22, like nobody's learning about it, so then everybody sucks at it. But then because everybody sucks at death and dying, they suck at grief. But because everybody sucks at grief, they're scared of death. So it just is this endless unhealthy cycle that I have come to see. And it's definitely a mission in my life to create more awareness around the dying process and grief, and how we can be courageous and show up for it. And I realize not everybody has that knack to be present at it, but maybe one person at least in every family should be capable or one person in your friend group, because we're all facing it all the time. And so that's how I got involved. And thanks for listening. That was kind of a long story made short, even though it still was pretty long. And I just encourage you, if you're inspired at all by this, many people have this calling, and it is a calling. And no matter what age you are, you might be ripe for this work, and reach out to me. I would love to talk to you about it, how to get involved. Over the years now, I've watched other people get involved who didn't have that straight shot to it right as a teenager like I did, but who it's so needed, and you're so welcome in this field. So yeah. All right. Much love, everyone.